right, welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Wes Elliot. Welcome, Wes.
Thanks, sir.
No, thank you for coming on. This would be a very interesting podcast, I think, for a lot of the listeners in the striking arts today. I mean, you've collected a shit ton of data. You've got your own boxing, I guess, tracker, you could call a punch tracker, sensor that does a lot of good things. So maybe provide a brief background about yourself and we'll go into some of, I guess, the findings you have and some data.
Yeah, so my name is Wes Elliot, and I own a technology company called Striketec. And what we've done is built sensors that essentially track the performance of boxers. It goes on the wrist. We've been doing it. I think my first sensor development was in 2011. So we've been doing it for quite some time, collecting data from, all different types of athletes, kickboxers, MMA fighters, boxers. And so, I kind of developed a consumer product that uses a mobile app, but we also have a side product that uses our desktop app. And that one's kind of more intricate in the capabilities of what we can measure. So, just been collecting data and in the game for a while.
Yeah, we're going to share some of that on this podcast too. But punching trackers are an interesting one. There's a lot of different ones on the market. What's one of the main issues with a lot of punching trackers now? I mean, obviously, a lot of them try and track the different kinds of punches. They give different values, force, power, velocity, etc. Is there an accuracy issue with many different trackers? Can someone rely on them to track their training?
Yeah, I mean, they can be reliable. There's a lot of issues that come up along the way. The biggest one that we ran into originally was Bluetooth. I know a lot of these other sensors are using BLE, and there's only so much throughput rate that you can get through a BLE, transmission. So, up until recently, there's BLE 5.0, which allows us to transmit more data across. But before that, we were just using standard Bluetooth connection, which only Androids have. But that was mainly because if we strip away too much of the data that we collect at that impact phase, it just becomes a bit more inaccurate or inconsistent, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a number of problems that we've had to address along the way, but I think that what we have right now is a good solution. It just becomes a lot of it rests on the user, right? Because they have to train consistently with the right, the same products, I guess, the same gloves, the same bag, if they're really wanting to get a good foundation or a baseline reading. But we can get into that. I know that I've listened to a couple of other podcasts that you've had, and there's a lot of, talk about the inconsistencies that come with the different types of bags and gloves and padding and stuff like that. So
yeah,
it's quite interesting.
Maybe we'll quickly dive into that before we get into some of that data. But obviously, one of the popular things, the Power Cube, is probably the most mainstream one that maybe most people would recognize listening to this. And if you don't recognize it, then you probably recognize what it looks like. I mean, you see all sorts of. I mean, Karate Combat was doing a lot with it. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson holding a big foam pad and having people kick it. People will talk about Francis Ngannou hitting the Power Cube and having the heaviest punch, basically. Yeah, exactly. So do you want to maybe dive into, is the Power Cube is that accurately testing punching force?
Well, it's measuring joules, right? And so that's a power measurement. And I don't really know. For me, pounds of force is just the basic, power number for me for force, right? Now they measure in newtons, and then pounds of force is just kind of like a different, I guess, type of reading. But if you stand on a bathroom scale, right, you're exerting pounds of force on that bathroom scale. And so I think it becomes a little bit easier for the user as well whenever there's numbers that they can easily recognize. It's like getting in your car and going, a certain speed limit at a miles per hour. If it's kilometers per hour, then, around here, they wouldn't know how fast they're going, right? So, the Power Cube, I haven't tested it. I've seen a lot of data on it. I'm actually glad that there's other products that are making some moves, because for the longest time, when we started this product in 2011, now the sensor was like the size of a pager, right? I mean, it was way too it was way too. It was big enough for us to use and collect right data on. I don't know that it was a consumer product back then, and it wasn't until 2000 and I believe 15 when we got it small enough to be able to make it to where it's not as uncomfortable on the
Yeah.
wrist. Um, but yeah, I mean back then it was just we were the only ones kind of doing it, and it was hard to find people that were part of this industry and to make this industry grow, because I think that it's going to require you know other products to kind of help grow this industry as well, and the interest in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, yeah, devices like PowerCube are definitely growing the interest there. How does, how it's mounted affect the output? Obviously, you have I think some videos of Wonder Boy holding it against his leg, taking readings, others where it's mounted on a solid beam. How does that change readings typically?
So when you have like a force plate inside of the bag, depending on the angle of the actual force plate, if you're hitting it straight on, or if it's angled, like if it's on his leg and it's angled just a bit, that force plate is driven off of a cylinder. And so basically you're just compressing this cylinder in order to get your reading of,
Mm.
your measurement of pounds of force, or joules in this case. And so, it just depends on the foam, the density of the foam. And also, is that foam, getting softer
Mm.
along the way? Right. I don't know the layers of that particular cube, but I don't. I think it's a starting point. I don't know how accurate it is, um, but being on a stationary target probably helps it out a lot.
Yeah. Nice. And then
Yeah.
obviously you've gone the extra mile. You've got the Striketec boxing sensors, ones that are essentially strapped to your wrist or your glove, and you're able to measure a lot of different variables that, I mean, devices like Power Cubes cannot, and a lot of different
Right.
variables. I guess more than what other boxing sensors can measure as well, which I really like this. So do you want to maybe dive into? I mean, you can share your screen now with some of the data, or we can just talk through some of it initially. But you've collected so much damn data from elite fighters, strikers, and you've broken down essentially the phase of a punch to the point where you can almost decipher what is a good punch, what is a bad punch, just by looking at some lines, which is pretty crazy. Um, and maybe just go into some details of, okay, what actually makes a good punch, or even a hard punch, or a fast punch.
Yeah. So let's dive into that first before we get into the data and kind of break down those different
Yeah.
phases, right? Um, I mean, the most important phase is the approach, right? And then I believe we were speaking before in the past that you know someone that has a better reaction time will start out with a higher acceleration, initial acceleration, which will allow them to gradually accelerate faster to the back,
Mm-hmm.
right? You guys have talked about the double peak, and there's a lot of different variables when it comes to measuring that as well. You don't know if it's a psychological issue, right? I know that we've seen a lot of this deceleration right before impact, and we're able to um, chat with the athlete and ask them about any injuries to their hands. And it's either a psychological thing where they've hurt their hands in the past. And so sometimes, whenever, like, if the bag is really, really heavy bag, because we've been in gyms where they use the 300-pound bags. It's just, they're massive and they're crazy, right? Um, or their wrists are bothering them, something, from grappling or something like that. But uh, yeah, the acceleration phase, the approach phase, to the punch or to the impact is probably the most important part of the punch, and it's really kind of where you're starting that acceleration, right? Someone that starts lower, obviously, they're going to have a harder time to
Mm.
accelerate to a point to where it makes a difference, right? As far as when the impact goes. Um, so yeah, I mean, I know working reaction time is probably one of the key components to any fighter that should be wants to box or train at least. Um, yeah, I mean there's a lot of variables when it comes to the so I don't want to. I'm trying to make it like easy to
Yeah.
understand without getting too muddy in the waters there. But
No, it makes sense though.
yeah, it's
It makes
yeah
sense what you're saying there around the initial acceleration. I think most people listening will be able to understand that idea of be able to accelerate faster initially. You got less room to make up, I guess, coming to impact. But should we break down some of the other phases as well after that?
Yeah. So, and another thing is technique, right? If you start seeing, in some of our approach, the acceleration curves, it'll be a little bit wavy, right? And so we essentially try to break down the approach into 3 phases. And we try to make sure that, from 0 Gs to like a third of the way in, that the acceleration, the rate of climb of the acceleration is still in the positive motion, right? Because there are a lot of times when it starts, when you have that heel. There's a couple of heels. It's not just a double peak, but it's and it also depends on the technique of that person, right? Are they twisting their wrist as they're punching, or are they kind of just more rigid? And then the hook is a whole nother story, right? I mean, trying to get a smooth acceleration through a hook I think a lot of it's technique, but also psychological. You got to make effort into not slowing down, into rotating.
Interesting.
Right. I mean, it's a timing thing for sure.
Nice.
So, and then once you make impact, um, you have peak impact, and then you have or peak, deceleration, a change of rate in acceleration, and then you have the area under the curve, which is the impulse of the punch, and we kind of do a calculation for both of those, and just over the years of having this database, we've kind of estimate an effective mass of that person. Right now, there's other variables in it, like technique. Right, if their rotation is correct along the way, and those criteria are basically set by athletes that have really good technique, right? And and I don't know that it's always technique that makes the biggest difference, because there are some athletes that don't look that pretty when they're punching, but they still hit hard, right? They're still fast, they still hit hard. They've kind of adapted to what what their technique is. So, I mean, once they hit the bag, depending on, the type of bag that they're hitting, right? If you hit a pillow, that area underneath the curve is going to be longer, but your peak is not going to be nearly as high. But if you hit a wall, right, you're going to have a short area underneath, the curve, and then a high peak. So, there's a lot of different variables when it comes that come into play during the impact point. But basically, in order to get a high force punch, you have to hit the bag fast, or the opponent, whatever it is, and you have to follow through, right? And so, depending on, I've had some data that I included the extension of the person's punch, right? And that's huge, because I know that we were when we were doing this for DirecTV had a boxing venue a long time ago called. It started out as Big Bare Knuckle Boxing, BKB, and then they went into Big Knockout Boxing, right? And I know that we had stats that came up on the screen. I think back then we went by like hit chip or something, but we had stats that came up on the screen, and I remember this one punch distinctly, because there were people that were kind of questioning the punch. And it was when a fighter was moving into another fighter, and so he jammed his punch. He wasn't able to accelerate for his full, extension of his punch. And so he met him about halfway, and the force was still high, but the speed was low. And that's kind of counterintuitive of what you would think would make a high force punch, right? But you're not taking into consideration that this object is moving towards you, right? So it might have jammed up your punch, but it moved towards you and helped you with that, impact. So, yeah, I mean, that's been interesting to kind of look at. We have so much data that, kind of listening to everybody's podcast talk about the research papers. I want to get more involved in that, because I think that it would be some interesting, findings from the data for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And if anyone's maybe listening to some of these terms like effective mass, double peak, muscle activation, etc., if after this you go listen to Seth Linetsky on the Sweet Science Funding podcast, he is, I guess you could say, one of the pioneers in that space. And we actually dive through all of that in that podcast too. And he's a bit of a big name in the space regarding that. But when you talk about follow through in a punch, just for visualization purposes, is that like when someone tells you to punch through the bag or through the pads versus just kind of hitting it?
Yeah.
That would be considered follow
Yeah.
through.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Because there's also like in Taekwondo and karate, they teach that
Yeah,
snap.
that
right?
point fighting.
Right. And I was always told that it's that snap that generates power, but it doesn't. Right. I mean, you have to follow through on the back. You have to follow through on anything if you're gonna affect that object. Right. And essentially, when we're measuring force, that's the whole point of it. Right. Is we want to measure damage to the object or the person. It's not just about how much you can generate as a boxer. It's about how much damage you can put into that bag or that person.
Yeah.
So whenever we're kind of taking a look at all these different aspects along the way of a punch, that's kind of the most important thing for us is to we want to measure damage done.
Nice. I was actually looking at some of the data you sent over, the UFC comparisons you did, and I was looking at average force on the side. I don't know if it's significantly different or not, but average force, I don't know. Can I say their names? I guess we're going to have it on the screen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Mickey Gall had the highest average punch force out of this cohort, but he had. I was trying to look at some of the impact durations as well. So that impact duration would be essentially the follow through, correct? And he had
That's right.
one of the higher, I guess, follow through durations too. So he was able to obviously had more time to impart that force on the opponent. Would that be correct assumption?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Whenever we did that study at the UFC summit, we've worked for them a couple of times in the UFC PI. It's really important. I think Seth mentioned this as well, but it's really important that the boxers that are training, that they put effort into it, right? Because I remember that day that there was a day that we went in there. It seemed like some of them put more effort than the other ones, right? Tiago Santos, you could tell when he started cracking on the bag. It seems like the whole boxing rack was just shaking, right? I mean, he was putting some serious power into it. And so Mickey Gall, he just at that time he was, he was being very technical and he was striking hard on the bag. He was trying to put effort into it, and I think that's, if we had like a routine for them, weekly or daily or whatever that we could put them through, I think we would see a huge difference in the data, right? And I know that Mickey Gall's a decent striker, but he's a jiu-jitsu guy, right? And Jimmy Rivera has some huge numbers as well. But he's a stout little guy, right? I mean, he's just really dense and he's got a lot of rotation that he puts into his punch.
Yeah. Actually, before I jump more into that data, we actually have a question on the live YouTube here. Someone was asking CTE Stare. That's a funny name. Would punching the heavy bag hard as it's swinging back, like you mentioned with someone walking in, be better for training effective mass than punching a stationary heavy bag?
So when they say swinging back, are they hitting it when it's swinging back?
I think
because
so.
You're not going to get a lot of effective mass, right, through the bag if it's moving away from you.
Swinging back towards them, I think.
Right. Swinging back towards you will help you generate more power. It just depends on, when it comes to that, it depends on the ounce of the gloves that you're training with and the strength of your wrist, right? I mean, or elbow, like the entire, chain, right? I mean, and you want to make sure that whenever they're making impact, that they're not, they don't have to be fully extended, but you want to be close to full extension, right? Probably, 80% of that, so that the other 20% you're driving through the bag. But yes, having a bag that's pulling back into you is a good way to, start strengthening that chain.
Nice. And to answer your second question there about what routine would be good for increasing punching power, you can go to the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. There is all the training programs in there. The Striking Dominate the Ring, plus the whole year's striking programming is in there. Andrew Usher also chimed in, a favorite guest on here. they've definitely seen technique as a big factor in the lab for punching speed and power. But I also wanted to around that Mickey Goal one, obviously with the highest thing. Here's some of the lowest average arm extension in that, but he's a long limbed individual. So
Yeah,
what
yeah.
happens there, basically?
Well, it depends on the type of punch that they're
Yeah,
throwing, right? If they're throwing hooks and they're standing
gotcha.
close to the bag,
Yeah.
right? If the bag's moving into them, um, I think there was a few different bags there that day, and they're all relatively the same, but some of them get punched on a lot more than the others,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it also depends on the height of the person, where they're striking in the bag, because if they're hanging low and it's a tall person. I remember Tiago. I go back to him because the bag moved a lot
Mm.
when he struck it, and it appeared as if he was putting a lot of force into it, which he does, but it was also higher up on the bag where it was easier to move it and make it, create this huge, display of strength. But if it would have been lower on the bag or midway through it, it would have been a little different, I'm sure. Right? It wouldn't have moved around as much. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on studying what actually, you know, the differences are between, why is this person, have a higher, force with a lower extension?
Mm.
What's their speed look like? What's their acceleration? Um, what's their rate of climb in their acceleration? Right. So, that's one thing that we're doing more a deeper dive into as well. And now that AI has kind of come a long
Oh yeah,
ways, we're working with that, and it's helping out tremendously,
yeah,
going through, because there's just so much data to go through.
yeah, dude. The stuff you sent me is another level. there's there's so much in there.
Well, that data is, so essentially, whenever when the sensors are running, um, it's measuring a lot of data, right? And so, but it's all raw data. It's just all acceleration numbers, gyros. We have two accelerometers on there. We have a high G and we have a low G, and then we have one gyro. And the amount of data that comes through those things is a lot. And so what we would do at first is we would store all of that data, but it would take up a lot of space on the phone. And so we would have it transmit to the server, to the cloud server, in between rounds. So that helped us kind of ship out a bunch of devices to professional athletes, and as they're training with their coach, right, we could have all of this data. And then that way, if we realize that some of our algorithms might be off a bit, we can go back and adjust it and rerun all of that data. So yeah, this converted data in the drive that I showed you is, I mean, for me, when I look at it, I'm like, it's just simple, right? Uh, because there's so much that you can extrapolate from the raw data, especially.
Yeah, I know you sent me some bare knuckle boxing summary as well. Do you see a difference in punching forces, speeds, anything like that between bare knuckle versus with gloves?
Yeah. So I think it was Joe Rogan that said that people don't quite hit as hard when it comes
He
to bare
just said that
knuckle.
actually on the latest podcast again.
Did it
Yep,
really?
with Eddie Bravo.
Um, it, I understand what he's trying to say when he says it, because essentially, if you have a bare hand, psychologically you're not going to want to punch as
Mm.
hard. What you have to take into account are a couple of things. One is they're wrapping their wrist,
Yeah.
right? So they're wrapping their wrist and the top of their hand, so they're not worried as much about breaking it. But what about the adrenaline that's going through them? If they have an open opportunity to punch someone, they're not pulling
Plus, there's
punches, right?
animals.
They'll
There's absolute animals in that
Yeah,
organization.
right. And so we ran a test where we built this big cylinder. This we made it like a punching arm, right? And we put a glove on the end of it, and then we put a load cell or force plate at the other end, and we would put different gloves on it. And the MMA gloves, it was like 150 like psi in the actual cylinder. It was striking around 800 pounds of force on this load plate, whereas the boxing glove was around like upper 500s.
Hmm.
So there was a huge difference just on that small amount of psi in the cylinder that we had. But what we were able to do is get it consistent, right? Because that cylinder, whenever a boxer is training, they it might seem like the data is inconsistent, but their speed, isn't always going to be the same, right? There's so much fluctuation in their actual speed of their punches. And so when we started kind of dialing everything in, I think I lost you
No,
there.
you're good.
But when we started dialing everything in, it was about getting this consistency through this punching piston, right? And then we've set up different, a lot of different fixtures in the labs that we were set up so that it was always the same thing every single time. It wasn't, we didn't have so many variables with a person punching. And then we would just run the, process on the actual people. We'd have, tons of different types of people come in, not just always professionals, because sometimes that skews your results as well.
I hope you're enjoying the chat so far. Before we get back to that, I just want to let you know that Sweet Science of Fighting is more than just a podcast. We have a full training app with strength conditioning programs for strikers, grapplers, and MMA athletes, so you don't have to think about what you're doing, and you're getting access to the latest scientific methods to improve combat sports performance. We have programs specifically for judo, for jiu-jitsu, for wrestling, MMA, boxing, Muay Thai is coming soon. All these things are going to be in the training app. We also have a private community where some of the coaches that have been on the podcast are in there to help you with any training questions and any performance questions you have. For example, Andrew Usher and Casper DeVitt. We also have some online courses within the training app. They cover strength, conditioning, mental skills, and weight cutting. And finally, we now have Ryan Villalobos in the community, a second degree jiu-jitsu black belt, who is there to break down any of your grappling matches that you want seen to by a second eye. He's currently breaking down videos on a separate Sweet Science of Fighting YouTube channel, and he will break down your video within the community. So if you have a match or a roll that you just recorded, you can upload that in there and Ryan will break that down for you. So what are you waiting for? Jump down in the description. You can check out the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. Otherwise, enjoy the podcast. Nice. So obviously with those tests, we see the MMA gloves with less padding, harder punches. And so we would assume that the bare knuckle would also be harder.
Yeah. Especially now, I feel like when they first started bare knuckle boxing, I don't know that there was that much of a wrap around their wrist. And now when I look at it, they're wrapping everything but their knuckles, right? And you're just that's just signing up for more power, right? I mean, they're just unleashing those punches now because, like I said, they're not worried as much about injury with everything kind of wrapped up and tight.
Nice.
So I would love to be able to. I know that having sensors on the wrist during boxing matches, we've been fortunate enough to be able to do it with some leagues that were, that accepted it and they wanted to learn from it. But it's a psychological thing with fighters too, right? I don't know that I've met a fighter yet that outside of being around other data scientists or with their coach that wants to have their data captured, right? Because they're kind of scared of it. And I get that, but if an opponent sees your data, that doesn't mean that they're going to beat you and they're going to be able to train for something, right? I mean, it's just, I don't know. I feel like the pros outweigh the cons by a mile when it comes to training with technology.
For sure.
And I think one of the biggest things is, we're always talking about speed and power. What about bad habits, right? What if whenever I throw a cross, I give a tell with my left hand and my left hand is popping, or if I throw a hook, right? Or what if I throw a combination more oftentimes than I think I do, right? Someone that's watching tape on you is going to see that and they're going to be able to pick it apart and counter from it. But if your coach was picking that up along the way, right, they could eliminate some of these, habits that you take on, because that's just something that we all do, especially when we're training, like doing shadow boxing drills or things like that. You kind of get in a flow of doing the same type of punches, right? So I think when it comes to mapping out a training routine, that's something that's very interesting.
Nice.
As well.
We actually have a question for you from Carlos Sanchez here on the live. It might be a good plug for Striketec actually, but he's asking how to track if you are making progress in your punching power if you work out at home.
Oh, I think you're cut
Oh,
out just a little bit. How do you track your punching
so
progress at
how
home?
do you track your punching power if you work out at home?
Well, we have our Striketec sensors. I think that's, if you want to go like a super cheap route, you can get a load cell or a force plate and strap it onto a bag, but you're hitting metal. I don't know. I mean, it's not that
That's
easy
not
to
ideal.
do when it comes to right a force plate. But sensors, I think, are the best way to do that. We have a mobile app that the user can go through and we have it granular level. Like I've seen some of these apps where it's just they give you an overall rating, but we track every single punch that comes through. And so we have three different levels of granularity on the training stats, right? So we have like a basic overview that kind of goes through the overall rating and then breaks down speed, power, endurance, and then we have our sensors communicate with a heart rate monitor. We work with Polar right now,
Mhm.
and so you can measure your heart rate while you're training as well. And so, and then you can break it down into um, uh, punch by punch, right, throughout your training session. And then you go down a little step further and you go to the training session and you can break down every single round and list all your punches that you threw, every single punch that you threw. Um, so it can get quite detailed for sure.
Yeah. If you haven't checked out Wizards, I'm going to put it in the chat here for everyone listening. But, I brought Wiz on. I mean, I'm typically my data science is pretty horrible, to be honest. But I've had Andrew Usher, who's in the chat there. I've had Seth Linetsky also check this stuff out. Wiz is a wizard with this stuff too. And the stuff they're doing is completely different to what these other brands are doing. Um, so if you're in the market for boxing sensors, yeah, just when Wes has got it nailed there. So check that out. But regarding the tracking your own progress as well, can you see technique or see technique, bad technique, quote unquote, or good technique through maybe some of this data with sensors?
You can. And so one thing that we didn't introduce yet into the app was rotational data, right? Is the impact, the rotation of the fist during impact. We do capture that, but, you know, you can get into so much detail that it becomes, a bit difficult to understand along the way, right? Um, so technique is a tricky one to kind of we can collect the data and we can convert the data. It's just putting it in a manner where someone
Yeah.
understands it is the difficult part, right? I think that's probably the most challenging part of any software is the user experience and the user interface of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can for sure measure, technique, and I guess technique is always dependent on, we've kind of experimented with trying to find technique either by someone that you choose, right? So if we have a certain style of boxer or kickboxer or Muay Thai fighter, right? They all have a little bit of different technique in the way that they
Mm-hmm.
punch. Um, so if someone wants to train like that, we're experimenting with introducing a couple of those to where it compares the user data
So
against
certain
that
styles. Oh,
style of punching.
cool.
Right. Right. So that it kind of helps dial you into, hey, you need to rotate 10 degrees, right? And then it has like a little animation. We have that on our desktop app. We're going to try to integrate that into the mobile app. It just becomes, I think now the mobile phones that are out are, almost as fast as laptops and computers. I think in the past, the processing like power of it kind of prevented us from introducing so many different features in the app, but it's getting to a point to where we can kind of speed that up, especially with AI and predictive analytics and machine learning.
Nice. And I know you sent me as well, like some almost like round by round data here. And I'm wondering if this is something that if someone was using Striketec sensors or whatever, if this, I guess, data would have any value. So you've got like force and speed, average force and speed in round one, round two, round three, and maybe you could see a trend across this. Is this something that someone could use potentially on sparring to to track progress at all? I know obviously there's a lot of variables in that with sparring is obviously a multifactorial arena. So, but is there a way like, hey, my average force is 4 weeks later is much higher over the rounds compared to what it previously was, or my average speed was higher? Is that something that could be used for as a progress tracker?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess it depends on like the goals for that user, right? We have people punch on the bag in low volume and then high volume, right? It's whenever you get into the high volume after 150 punches is when you start deteriorating, and that's what brings down your average, right? So, you know, you just have to analyze the data correctly based on what your goals are, right? If you're looking at your overall average and it's 2,000 punches in the database that you're looking at it as, it's going to be harder to bring that number up. You kind of got to go down a little bit,
Mm.
lower level on it to analyze it.
Interesting. So you could even look at that almost like the threshold of punches it takes for your speed and average force to start to drop.
Oh yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, that's kind of how we measure,
Yeah.
fatigue and endurance. Is the goal for us was to figure out at what round does someone kind of start losing momentum, right? Um, I have a good comparison of uh, Stevens and Rosado. I can't remember Curtis Stevens and Gabriel Rosado, something like that. They fought for BKB. It was crazy because every single match that we recorded for them, we could determine who the winner was based on just looking at the
Oh wow.
analytics quickly, right? But they didn't reveal all of that stuff to the judges because we didn't, that's that's a whole other conversation. But um, in that last fight, uh, Gabriel was the champion and Stevens was challenging for it, but Stevens had, he had more damage on Rosado, higher speed still. Rosado's speed had gone down quite a bit in the later rounds, and he didn't throw near as many punches. And so, I mean, for us, it was the clear winner of Stevens, but he didn't end up winning it according to the judges. So I remember behind the scenes, everybody was kind of like, "This is why you need technology in
Mm.
this sport, right?" It's like there's very little requirements to be a judge, right, or a commissioner for that matter. Um, and it's hard to see everything, right? It's like the coaches that say that they can tell when their athletes hitting harder or punching faster. I mean, I get it that they feel like they can, but what if that coach held mitts, for 10 other fighters and maybe they had less energy the next day. But there's so many different
Yeah.
variables when it comes to feeling something, right? And you can't see when it comes to punching that fast, you can't see the difference in a few miles an hour, right? But that makes a big difference on impact.
Mm.
So it's just not easy to. It's not a good thing to gauge visually.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to gauge visually.
Kind of have my brain connected to different things now, but obviously with Andrew Usher's new research showing, punch count isn't a indicator of work capacity. So if anyone's familiar, I broke down his research paper on the channel last week, I think it was. Muscles weren't recovering between rounds, but punch count stayed the same. I'm thinking now with, obviously that's a harder thing to track for most people, muscular recovery, having to wear moxie sensors and things. But if you have a punch sensor, maybe like Striketec, and you're doing that, maybe you're looking at punch count already, but you can actually see speeds drop off, maybe round to round or towards the end of the round, indicating fatigue there as well. So that
Yeah.
that might be almost like uh, a field test of doing it versus having to do it the other way. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. There could be an interesting little application.
Yeah, well, when it comes to punch count, it goes back to like a habit or just like how a person trains. Because if they're used to just throwing a certain amount of volume within 2 or 3 minutes, they're going to try to continue to do that for as long as they can, as long as they have energy, right? Because unless they're really, really tired, they're not going to sit for 10 seconds without throwing something, right? I mean, it just depends on what kind of fight's going on if it's a boxing match, right? But the speed and the power is a whole different story, right? Because they might not be punching nearly as fast or hitting nearly as hard, but I think it's just a training. It's just inside of them of how much, how often to throw a punch whenever they're in the ring, right? That's something that you probably just pick up through training,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I think so.
So yeah, I could see where punch count isn't as big of a you know detector, I guess, as it would be like
Hmm.
speed and the power of the punch for sure,
Yeah. You
right?
mentioned actually, I
But
was going to say with the judging thing you were talking about there, how the winner, maintained or had higher force and velocity, etc., is doing more damage. Is that something you see as potentially, I guess, an objective way for judges to judge fights? Because obviously, damage. I mean, at least within the UFC, like damage is the number one factor they've made for judging. So, I
yeah,
mean, if you're looking at damage, you're probably looking at how hard are the strikes, and that's probably the only indicator you could do.
I mean, I think that's what classifies
Yeah.
damage, right? Is how hard someone was hit. Um, I think that we're trying to introduce technology into a, a sport that's been around for a long time that is just about people, you know, uh, you fight just guys fighting, girls fighting, right? And that's kind of the old school people and the old school way of thinking. We still have a lot of those guys around, and especially when it comes to judging, and they're just a little bit timid on introducing something that they might not understand, right? But it's just like our parents and then grandparents. They used to say that they're not going to text anybody until everybody texts, and it's like you don't have a choice, right? You got to kind of you got to keep up with technology. I don't see why a big organization. I know that we've communicated with the UFC quite a bit. Um, that company now is just so big; it's hard to be in the room with the right people at the right
Yeah.
time that are all on the same page, especially when you have that many people running a huge thing like that.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think it needs to be implemented into the sport. I know that I think everywhere except for here, they do open scoring for boxing, right? So that they reveal the judges' score after each round. I know that there was a couple of apps that they were trying to introduce open score, boxing here in the states, and they were just kind of like they didn't want to change, right? I know that they pushed it for years, but the judges and stuff they just didn't want to change. But I will say that in 2016, I believe it was, the Nevada Athletic Commission approved us to use our sensors in a live
Mm.
fight, and it wasn't easy. I mean, I remember going there, and it was there was like 10 news crews there, and it was and every other commission, I feel like it's easy to just kind of communicate with the commissioner. You can just pop in their office and go through a few things, have a doctor explain some things about the sensors. Um, but at Nevada, they're all attorneys, right? I mean, it's 8 attorneys up there, and it's like going into a court hearing where they're all sitting up in front of you. And I was told that I was just going to meet up with them in their office, and then they set me, they called me up, and I'm having this hearing, right? And I'm trying to convince these guys into why they should allow me to put the sensors in the or use them during the fight, right? And fortunately, they were open to it, and everything worked out great. Yeah. So I was I was happy that they were at least willing to try, because at first they just told me no, and then one guy put his foot down and said if he's willing to go out on a limb, he's going to be the one looking bad if it's a joke out there. He goes, let him try. And so then they all kind of jump, but it just goes to show you, like, if you can get a couple of people in there that are pro technology and kind of evolving the sport, then I think it's good news for everybody.
Yeah. And I know, yeah. And Josh has chimed in again on the chat. He's very excited about what we were talking about before regarding looking at punches thrown with your Striketec technology along with muscle oxygenation at that point where you start to see that fatigue, comparing punch kinetics and oxygen kinetics simultaneously. So effective punches, quantifying what they are, etc. I mean, obviously the PhD hasn't beaten Andrew down yet. He's still excited about collecting more data. So that's a good sign. But is some of this, or is a lot of this, I guess, transferable to kicking as well? I mean, you can't just place the sensors on your legs, I'm assuming, because obviously the app's algorithm is based on a punch. But would that be something you're looking to at in the future, or is that something you can do now? Oh,
Yeah, we can
okay,
do it
sure,
now.
okay.
It's not specific for a punch until it comes to the technique,
Gotcha.
right? But that's something that you can just you can learn. You can just write some algorithms for the app to understand what rotation, what acceleration should be in place for a certain technique, right? And we have a skill level in our app too, which kind of allows us to assess the fighter, because I know when we talked about effective mass, right? If you have an exact clone of yourself, one of you guys have been training for 10 years, one has never thrown a punch in his life, but you guys have exactly the same measurements, who's going to punch harder, right? Clearly the person who's been training for 10 years, right? So, but there are characteristics about that person, their punch, that are different, a lot different than this punch from the guy who's never punched anything, right? And those are the things that we take into consideration whenever we're assigning someone essentially an effective mass, right? It's hey, we need to look at what their acceleration looked like to impact. And you can't do it just off of one punch, right? The more punches you put into the system becomes a better, it's a better detection of the skill level of that particular user, right? And that was kind of hard to develop along the way, but I think that's kind of the only way to really get consistency and measuring the force of a punch.
Nice. Do the same, I guess, principles apply? For example, you mentioned the initial acceleration of the punch being the most important part of it. Does that the same apply for the kick as well then? Hey guys, it's me again. I just want to let you know that I also have Sweet Science of Fighting rash guards and shorts, so you can represent Sweet Science of Fighting on the mats and within competition. We have the classic, just like the shirt I'm wearing, rash guard, Sweet Science of Fighting on the front, and we have the logos on the sleeves, and then X Marsh on the back. We also have that in a shorts variation, same thing, with the Sweet Science of Fighting writing on one leg, and we have the logo on the other. But my personal favorite, this is my personal favorite by far. We have this in black and white, and it is the Taniwha Protector Guardian version of the Sweet Science of Fighting, with the logo on the back. This was designed by a Māori designer back in New Zealand, so a bit of my heritage on this jersey. It represents the acknowledgement of battle and war. It also represents strength and stability, and also has the New Zealand silver fin. But even if you're not a Kiwi, cop this. This is an awesome design. It is a custom made design. You will not find it anywhere else. So check that. That'll also be down in the description with a discount code. But back to the podcast.
I think it's, as long as you can, it's the fast twitch muscle fibers, right? I mean, that really engaging into the movement as quickly as you can will always yield higher results than moving slowly into it, right? Because there's just so much you have to make up for when you start off slow. And so, I mean, it's essentially the same principles. You're just, accelerating your leg a lot further along than you are your punches, which, do you remember the show Fight Science?
Kind of. It's been a while.
There was a TV show on, I think, National Geographic a long time ago. It was called Fight Science, and they analyzed like Boss Rutan punching a dummy and rupturing its liver or something. It was just kind of, it was crazy, kind of the stuff that they did. But they had martial artists on there from different places around the world, really, and they were measuring kicks, but they put a sensor on a bag that had a spring on it, and it would go back and forth, right? And so we worked with Cindy Burr, who was on the engineering team there, who kind of put everything together. But they made a lot of mistakes. They kind of just whipped that thing together quickly for entertainment value, but they were trying to, they came out and said that there was people that were kicking 150 miles an hour. And I'm like, Jesus, there's no way, right? Like, you just can't even, you can't come close to that, right? And I think whenever we started showing how fast people punch, even for the broadcast, right? Because they're trying to sell entertainment and then tell a story as well, right? And so whenever we would tell them, hey, well, 30 miles an hour is a fast punch, right? And they're like, well, why? I mean, if someone throws a baseball, it's 90 miles an hour. And I said, well, that baseball is accelerating a lot longer than the punch is, right? But if you think, and so we started measuring the hand speed of baseball players, pitchers, right? And so you have more than double the extension, but even at like we measured a guy that threw 98 miles an hour, his hand speed was 31 miles an hour,
Mm-hmm.
the baseball pitcher, right? Now, you take a boxer, and he's not stretching and reaching
Mm-hmm.
back, right? This boxer is accelerating from 0 to 30 miles an hour just in front of him. I mean, that's a lot faster than the pitcher's arm,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's all about just, I think telling that story is what we were trying to, accomplish along the way when we had these on the big screen. And, it's just going to take more time in the seat,
Yeah.
right?
How do you see AI getting more into this combat sports analysis? I know I emailed you one a little while ago. I don't know if you saw it. That basically,
The video.
yeah, that basically breaking down like a whole fight with AI and being able to punch count all sorts of things on there. What's your take on that and the future of the things being used?
Yeah, we're working. We have some of that technology as
Nice.
well. Just motion tracking, object tracking, and I think it pairs well with our sensors. So because we have a cool little feature in our app that allows you to record yourself while you're working out, and then you have like a video overlay of the speed of the punch and the power of the
Mm.
punch, right? And so you can save that video, or you can take screen grabs from the video, and it just kind of gives a cool little shareable picture with the overlay on it, right? Um, but I mean, yeah, we just have there's a lot going on in the market with AI. I think that I think it's going to help. I hope there's no resistance from the judges, right, and the
Yeah.
commissioners. I think if they would just embrace it, that they could be a part of it as well. Because we're not here to make them look like they don't do a job well. We still want them to be in charge, right? AI is not just here to take over everybody's job; it's here to
Mm.
assist. I mean, that's the way that I look at it. But yeah, the motion tracking is really been advanced, especially with a couple of these companies like
Yeah.
OpenAI. They're just moving it along quickly, but they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars into those
Yeah.
things, right? So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice. No,
we're
yeah,
excited
I
for
think
it
I think
too.
that's everything I've got for you today, Wes. But where can people find you and keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm at Striketec on all the social media, Facebook, Instagram. For a while there, we kind of laid low on that because we were working on the back end with, we worked with Bally's Fight Night and a couple of other organizations, and so now we're starting to kind of get back into the content sharing. But striketech.com, and I'm at Striketech across all the different social media
Perfect.
channels.
We'll link those up in the description. So whether you're listening to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever it is, it'll be down there for you to check out. But thanks for coming on, Wes. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.